Please tell me a bit about your career and when did your interest for startups started?
Well, I graduated computer science, and at some point around 12 years ago, I said, let's do a startup. So I went to a startup weekend, and luckily I was in the winning team. So then we got mentoring sessions, office, and a little bit of visibility in the local ecosystem there. We got as well funding from a VC fund from Bulgaria. At that time, there were no VC funds in Romania that we could access. It was from Launch Hub. And we even lived there, so getting to know the Bulgarian ecosystem, which was a little bit on the funding side more advanced. Of course, we failed, as it happens often with a startup. But all that experience going through creating the product, launching it, getting a few thousand users, monetizing, and then failing as well, and saying that is not worth pursuing, was quite a good 3-year adventure. So basically afterwards, I built on that, helping out other startups, doing a little bit of corporate innovation here in Bucharest or in Cluj with companies which wanted to create products. Back then, failure was not really accepted, so I was among the few who was talking about my failure publicly in presentations and workshops. So people were quite appreciative that I was sharing about the challenges we had both on the mental side, how to deal with various stress and anxiety and pressure we had, but as well when it comes to business marketing and all these things about product launch and so. And in the meantime, because there were no, I didn't know many startup founders back at home, we decided to let's create a Facebook group for people just to announce, share the events that were happening in the community, and then yeah, to start sharing various information, support things, and so. That group grew in a couple of years to around 3,500 people. And then we also had mastermind groups with startup founders every 2 weeks trying to help each other and give us feedback. And that was amazingly valuable. And then, yeah, in the meantime, I founded an organization called Cluj Startups, which was supporting the community. Afterwards, we went with FreshBlood.Health Tech, which was a spin-off from Cluj Startups focusing on the health tech area. Because this was starting to arise and grow in the ecosystem. Then Transylvania Angels Network, which was groups of angels, business people who wanted to do angel investing in startups but didn't know exactly how. So it was a vehicle for that, which grew quite well in the past 3 years. Then as well, helping startups with acceleration programs, going with helping support for fundraising. So a lot of things that were need-based. So we saw that what happens in the ecosystem, and somehow I was crazy enough to create an organization for each of these activity, and then get some partners, and then let them lead, and so. And here we are.
What was the name of the startup you co-founded?
It was called Use Together. It was a platform for sharing economy, people sharing their items at home that they were not using. So, for example, cameras or ski equipment or tents that they could rent or give to some of friends of and colleagues.
And why weren't you a founder again and you focused on developing different organizations, consulting with corporations for their programs? How did you not start a startup again?
Well, I actually started a few other startups as well. So I was budgeting, let's say, a limited budget for a year for an idea, gathering maybe 2 or 3 people and trying to make it work. And I worked on the way around 4 to 5 other startup ideas. But I've learned the lesson from the first startup about validation and seeing if it works or not. So imagine with a budget of 10,000 euros, trying to see if it works, if we can make it happen. And most of the times it was proven that it's not worth building it into a startup further on. So that's why I stopped. These are among the organizations that didn't work out to grow and develop and be stable.
How do you remember I wouldn't call it the ecosystem, but the word back then when you started your first startup, maybe afterwards when you started the Facebook group for Cluj Startups, what was the buzz around?
And so many people were interested about the word startup, especially there in Cluj. We have a lot of IT and software developers, and they were catching up quite fast with what happens in Western Europe or in US. So there was a vibe, but there was not much real traction. So there were a lot of meetups happening, and still are, mostly on technical part, and it was crazy. I mean, not that many events as it happens now, but still many, and it was quite engaging. So I remember I was going almost every evening to an event or a meetup with startup folks or wannabe startup founders. So that was interesting, but there was base level about knowledge about startups, but not much advanced things. So then starting from 2015, going to 2017, a couple of other good examples, raising a little bit more money, growing the teams, and afterwards, I would say only in the last 5-6 years, we saw grown startups.
What do you think was the influence of big IT companies opening in Cluj? We know it as a city with corporations that have offices there. Maybe it's somehow the same example with Yash nowadays.
Yeah.
What was the impact of those companies, and was it a good thing for the startup ecosystem? Because some people say that people were trapped inside those companies with good salaries, afterwards kids, and a good life.
Actually, I have a story which was statistically somehow proven. If we compare Cluj, for example, the municipality in the first around 15 years after the revolution were kind of blocking the access of big companies from outside to open offices in Cluj, while in Timișoara they were allowed. So that meant that during that time frame, the local Romanian entrepreneurs decided to build IT software companies. So they grew, and by the time the municipality kind of opened up to receive various outside corporations, what happened is that they were strong enough and big enough, 50, 100, maybe 200 people, with the aim to actually compete in terms of salaries. And these local entrepreneurs went and sponsored tech meetups, startup weekend events, or other startup related meetups. And this enriched the community quite a lot compared with Timișoara and with Iași. So I think the history goes back even before we had the startup ecosystem. But this way we see the consequences. And now those companies that were actually funding these meetups or small programs or events that we were having, now they're actually being like 1,000 people or more, and they are now sold to external corporations. But they are software outsourcing companies, but also they wanted to play with products. So they always there was this stream from outsourcing to product, and this was a often met topic in the discussions we had.
If you remember back then, when you first started your startup and going to the meetups, who were the people who would you name as being part of those inception days of the ecosystem? In Cluj, maybe if you came also to Bucharest to events.
Mm-hmm. So I think one person who was paramount for Cluj ecosystem was Filip Kandal. He founded Scobbler as a company in digital maps. And basically he came to Cluj specifically to grow the company there from the technical perspective. And then that company, Scobbler, was every year funding some meetups or some events that we were having, and Filip was amazing as a mentor. Then he sold Scobbler and he moved to Telenav, and then he moved to the HQ in San Francisco, and then he moved to Singapore, working for still companies which are big startups which are in the area of mapping. And while in Bucharest, and Filip was paramount for Startup Weekend, for Transylvania, sponsoring and facilitating the event and helping out a couple of other communities during that time, 2012 to 2015. Afterwards, I also lived in Bucharest for a couple of years. I would say the Tech Hub, How to Web community and conference, and as well MVP Academy, and together with Tech Angels and Impact Hub at that time was doing also things. So it was like a nice environment in which things were happening in Bucharest as well. So just 3 years spending in Bucharest, a couple of months a year, I got to know a lot of people during that time.
You mentioned Philip and the importance of him being a mentor, supporting this kind of events, and it was maybe it was a new thing for the companies, for the ecosystem, for the big business ecosystem to have founders that help other founders, that are taking the time to give feedback. How was this process of discovering that business can work otherwise than competition, or maybe what we knew in the 90s as business people?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of mental blockages that we as founders had back then. Is sharing about the issues we had, so everything had to be shiny and well presented on one side. On the other side was trust, sharing details that were maybe sensitive, but in the end it's just our worries that someone could copy or steal ideas or things, which doesn't really happen. And then Philip was coming with a different perspective, coming from the German ecosystem. So he saw how startups were growing there. So I think he kind of created a couple of leaps forward in the local ecosystem. I would say also the mindset of asking money or asking help, this was not mainstream. We didn't know how to talk with the investors. I remember when I was in Sofia negotiating with LaunchHub, I stayed 1 week and a couple of meetings with them to explain us a 2-page term sheet. So you can imagine, and that was I think 11 or 12 years ago. So it was just 2 pages and sitting and reading so many legal terms that I didn't have a clue about it.
I know that you have also a story talking about feedback with Sergio Goods, if I'm not mistaken, or not, of asking for an investment and being rejected.
I remember when it was in 2013 here at Tech Angels. We presented this together, and it was a platform which didn't have a clear business model yet. So from the business perspective, it was not a strong asset. So there was a lot of feedback, which was harsh back then. And also, I think this is about the founder's mindset that feedback was not really well accepted. Yeah, and also on the other side, the business people or the investors at that time, they were not so well educated in giving feedback. So I think there was sometimes there was a mismatch, which in time, growing experience altogether, there was a better communication and being able to understand what investors want and also what founders need, and this having a better match along the years.
So you mentioned the early days of meetups and people gathering and exchanging information, maybe the early days of Cluj Startups. And if you were to make a portrait of a local ecosystem for a city such as Cluj, what would be the elements, the important elements, which were formed in Cluj? Maybe what's lacking now?
Mm-hmm. So what we had back then and what is lacking now. Okay. So I think back then we had the curiosity and energy and the drive to mingle and to find out things. So the meetups were quite active and people talking quite a lot with each other. But also there was a sort of naivety about what we can do. So it was very easy to get impressed with what you read in the startup media about startups raising millions and so. But it was tough to find how hard was all the background things that were happening in order to get to that level. But being naive in this sense, people were enthusiastic and willing to try to test. And we didn't have enough business knowledge, marketing knowledge, sales knowledge, but we knew as an ecosystem to build products. So I think there were a lot of products which were built, somehow launched, but in the end they were not getting market traction because of lack of validation, because of lack of value proposition, because of lack of marketing skills. Now I see the ecosystem more developed in the sense that we talk early on about business, about marketing, promotion, or as well product, the value proposition, all these things. And I encourage founders not to develop from the technical side, try to validate without building product if possible. And as well, what I see then, we were quite general, so there was not enough critical mass. But what happened along the years, we saw verticals which were more interesting for startup founders. More people were piling up to do things in that vertical. And this was also based on what we had on the local level and as well in the whole Romania. So I remember 7-8 years ago, it was about fintech. And there were fintech meetups, and the banks were jumping into it to see how they can collaborate with startups. And then the health tech wave started. So in health tech, now we have quite a lot of activity on health tech startups and programs in Cluj, because this is one of the areas that we all together want to focus. Then I saw the trend a little bit slower growing of urban mobility in the past couple of years. Then now it's mental health that will grow. As well, green tech area is slowly piling up. So we see all kind of trends like this. And now I just come from a EdTech community pre-launch event. Together feedback was like 20 something founders. So I think an ecosystem is big enough or is growing in the moment when you start seeing verticals, because in a vertical you have mentors who are specialized, startups who are focused on the industry, so this means sharing context, sharing knowledge, investors who are interested in that vertical much more than in others. So growing on a vertical and having expertise on that vertical can really help a lot more startup than being in a general program. And my bet, in the next 5 years, we're going to see vertical growth quite a lot.
You mentioned the naivety back then. Do you think, or do you feel that we, while growing our expertise, we lost a bit of that naivety and enthusiasm of the people building things, or it's just a natural thing? Maybe we don't see people too much, they are working.
Yeah, so I think it's a natural thing. After you've been a couple of years in the industry, you're not that enthusiastic about everything, because it's much tougher that you imagine from the outside without knowing it too much. But in the same time, there's a fresh wave of new people joining who have more experience, even if they're younger. I see a lot of enthusiasm, but also experience in people who are now 25, but also people who have business experience, but they were not thinking about startups. But now they have 10, 15, 20 years experience, and they really know the industry. So they are having the capacity and also a little bit of financial gain at the beginning to put in the startup and launch the startup this way with their own capital. So I think people are wiser now compared with 10, 15 years ago, much wiser. And of course, the costs of running a startup are higher, but also we have more access to venture capital, to public funding, and all sorts of funding lines and investors. And as well, the angel networks are quite active on the early stage with programs, accelerators, and so on, trying to catch startups and support them. First, you usually become a mentor, and then you talk with the startup for a couple of months, you see how they develop. Okay, now it's time to maybe do a small pre-seed round. I'll get a couple of other people who are interested in your startup. So now we can actually say that, okay, there is a pipeline, there is a process through which as a startup you can grow.
Going back to Cluj Startups, how did the community develop, and how did it help the local ecosystem from a humble Facebook group of people with shared interests to maybe gathering them offline and helping them, connecting them?
So actually doing this and also doing vertical communities, being involved in a couple of them, I saw like a recipe that you can build. So first is, okay, you see a couple of startup founders or people interested in the domain. It could be regional, local, or it could be a vertical. You gather them together in a communication channel, could be Facebook group, WhatsApp, or LinkedIn group or so. And then afterwards organizing a meetup to get to know them and share some experiences, and then facilitating some intros. And then maybe we also thought about creating an NGO, seeing if that trying to get some sponsorship from a couple of companies which were interested to support the ecosystem. continuing with the meetups and then thinking about a new program that could be launched. It at first doesn't have to be advanced, so it could be something very basic in the sense that is just enabling the communication among founders, and then in the second, third year you can build up on that and do bigger things. So this is a community gameplay that I saw happening in smaller areas or larger domains, just on this. In a very similar way. It's just the time frame difference. So if you understand these elements, you can actually have, instead of 5 years of community growth, you can compile it and get it down to 2 or 3.
And going to the more present days and talking about Transylvania Angels Network that you mentioned, tell us more about the purpose of gathering the angels in the region, because we know that we have in Bucharest Tech Angels, which is somehow a national community, but very Bucharest-centric.
Yeah.
So what was the role of Transylvania Angels Network?
So what happened back then, several years ago, at Cluj Startups, we had startups which were looking for funding, and we didn't know, who to recommend them locally. So one of my colleagues, Ahmed, said, hey, I have some budget, and as well I know 10 more people who would be willing to invest in startups. So let's get together the people that we know. So we started, I think, with 15 to 20 people, and now we reached 70 some time ago. So it was a natural, gradual process. The more people were hearing about startups, the more they were interested and saying, okay, let's, I have a budget I could spend this year on a startup, let's see how it is. A couple of them were more advanced and they were doing other investments from previously, so they decided, okay, now I can take this game of angel investing a little bit more serious. So this is how things grew. With meetups, now we just had the 50th meetup. In total, the members invested around 3 million euros in 20 deals in the past 4 years and a half.
A lot of people in the community are from tech companies, maybe, but also they have general businesses. And I wanted to talk about them. In your opinion, how do they understand right now startups and tech startups? And what's the right way of presenting a startup to someone who has money for investment, but maybe he thinks or she thinks that maybe the stock exchange is better, whatever, a new building is a better investment. How do you convince them to go to startups?
So at first, yes, there were people coming from the tech area, being either managers or developers, senior developers, and understanding technology and startups at a decent level. But then we saw people coming from various backgrounds, like medical, like lawyers, like real estate. And the more the trend grew and more news about startups we had, then people were getting more curious, and they were interested but not yet sure how to tackle this, because it's quite a different industry to understand, especially if you think about real estate and how the returns are happening there. This is different and the risk is much higher. So they were looking to understand, so they were trying to see who can help them. So they were coming to a meetup, to an educational workshop, and then say, okay, this is interesting. This year I could invest maybe 10,000 euros together with other angels. So let's see how it goes with this. So it was not with high expectations, but the mission was and still is to educate people and to bring people from other areas in order to invest in startups, even if they don't have a big budget. It's about supporting local startups which will have a hard time raising from elsewhere, but who have potential and have creativity, and they are promising. And the first deals that we did came from networks. So we knew the people, the founders, we trusted them, we communicated in various contexts before, so it was the right time then to invest. So okay, let's play it a little bit safer. And then when the pandemic came, everything moved online, so we had founders that we met just online and never face to face yet.
We have networks and angel investors. We have funds for pre-seed, seed rounds. How can we bridge this investment gap locally here in Romania to go to maybe growth investment fund, to Series A? Because startups that want to go to Series A, they go abroad to funds from abroad because they don't have the resources here to find. We don't have the funds. How do you think we can bridge this gap?
Yeah, so I think the base is better communication at each of the levels. So we have, let's say, the pre-seed level. I started using this term lately, but as well the pre-seed level where the angel investors are, and they are deeply embedded in acceleration or various programs for startups. And we really have a good communication with Growth Channel and with Tech Angels, for example, and we oftentimes do co-investments. So and then oftentimes we meet with VCs, but the VCs are waiting to be in the next level usually, and that is fine as well. This is their investment thesis. So at each of this level, if we have a better communication and trust, now with 10 deals co-invested with the other angel networks, things are much easier, and we trust to give leadership to any of the people who are involved and with whom we had collaborations, because we have clearer processes compared with 5 years ago. And then I still think the Romanian ecosystem on the venture capital area and angel investment is small. I think we're tapping very little of all the potential possible and money accessed. But it's a growing process. And in terms of Series A, in Romania, for example, for a fund, it doesn't make sense just to focus on one country in Eastern Europe. So that's why Series A needs to be tackled on Eastern Europe level. So if you have, for example, 50 million or 100 million fund, the best is to invest in countries around in Eastern Europe, because you have better chances this way and you can tap in a higher capital in a larger market, and it's much more challenging to focus and select just in one country, because you might not select the best startups just for the sake of deploying the capital, and it doesn't make sense because you cannot give back the return that you promised to the limited partners.
Why do you think we see these kind of funds around us, and maybe to the west and also to the east, if you think about Turkey, for example? Why don't we see right now this kind of funds, regional funds, starting from Romania? It's a matter of evolution of the ecosystem, maturity. We need some more years.
Yeah, so from this perspective, I think we're 5 years behind the Bulgarian ecosystem, because the scheme that was implemented with European Investment Fund in 2017 was implemented in Bulgaria around 2011 and 12. So it was just a government decision on how to give the money to the ecosystem, and the Romanian government at that time decided differently, and that's why we saw the venture capital industry developing so fast. And in 2012, there were 8 startups from Romania living in Sofia and getting investment from the Bulgarian funds, just because we couldn't find here in Romania. But overall, I think there were trials to raise. So to be at Series A, I think it's good to have around 100 million euro fund, and that is quite hard to make from the Romanian raise purely. So you need to have limited partners who are from international. And I believe there was a lot of raise happening in Poland, for example. And now the Central European funds are kind of trying to cover Romania as well. It's just the way the ecosystem developed in time. I know there were trials and people and good teams who wanted to raise that amount, but in the end they needed to lower their expectations because it was hard to raise just from the Romanian market such a big fund.
In your opinion, and I'm splitting the question between the local authorities and central authorities, what is the ideal role that the local and central authorities should have in developing the startup ecosystem? And if you saw in our country some good examples of supporting the ecosystem, and if not, what should be done? Because usually entrepreneurs would say the government should step aside and let us do our way, the Silicon Valley way, but maybe you need a bit of support.
Yeah. Not even US, the government is not stepping aside, and didn't stay aside at the beginning, because they actually created the regulatory framework together with the people who are involved in the ecosystem in order to make it easy to invest, in order to make it easy to create funds, in order to make it easy to qualify as a startup, a pure technology product startup, not like any kind of new company started. So it is an important role in regulation and setting up the frame, but this in discussion always with the people involved in the ecosystem who can come up with real problems and saying, okay, this law is not helping us at all because it's getting us stuck in the process. And on the other side, the government can direct public funds where, for example, investors would not put money. So instead of having maybe a general program like Startup Nation, having programs which are really focused on innovation, but not innovation which doesn't have to be measured in brevet, but needs to be measured in something which, because startups are not usually going into that area, they just focus on the product, and they launch it on the market. So from this perspective, I think it's relevant to have change in regulations on one side, and then directing the funding in the areas where they lack, where the private space will not give money. So this could be technology transfer, which is a trend starting to show up now, and connection with the business environment, not just doing research for the sake of research, as it happened much time, and also maybe giving money on some verticals that we see potential and where there is enough experience, but because of the lack of public funding, things are not growing fast enough. So they could, public money well spent this way can double the speed of growth in some verticals, for example.
And can, for example, local authorities do something? Maybe not funding because there is not enough funds there, but making it easier for startups.
Yeah, actually, I have a couple of examples in this area. Local authorities from Regional Development Agency are they got a grant, and together they put some other public money, and they created a program on health tech, Level Up, and many people from the local ecosystem were present and active in that program, and now we're looking how this can be set up for the next years. And as well, there are some public money for innovative startups, but with some strict regulations as well. And as well, there is a grant line for creating new incubators, and as well they will be now they're working on a framework to create local or regional VC funds based on the venture capital law and processes.
You mentioned the moment that happened in Bulgaria with the European Investment Fund, afterwards in Romania. And do you think that access to this kind of European funds, European investments, was essential in developing every local ecosystem? Because we saw in Romania 2 or 3 funds appearing, and immediately after, investment after investment. Yeah. Not too much, 100, 200K, but we saw investments in a very speedy rate.
It's paramount. This is the model of functioning all over Europe. And basically many venture capital funds from Europe, they're having 40 to 70 or 80% European investment fund money through various lines and processes. But this is one of the theses of the European Union, to support innovation and venture capital and startup development this way, in order to be in a competing environment with what happens in US and what happens in China. Because now there is, on the global level, I think this European Union, China, India a little bit, and then US, and we all try to do on various models to get the best of what we have as talent. But I think in Europe, if we think strategically, we still have this fragmentation, and basically we need to work out on this. European Union can really compete only if it's one. If it doesn't matter from which country you are in, and we still have a lot of work to do on this area. And it's not just about startups, it's about the economy in general.
I wanted to ask you about this, because in theory, the thesis of EU is amazing, but we still have 27 markets, even for startups, for a technology product, and fragmentation, and what would be the right way of pushing the ecosystem as one, or maybe regionalizing, because we don't have too many connections between Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Yeah. We know each other, but we don't have so many.
Yeah, so definitely this is a problem on the European level, and especially in Eastern Europe, where we have smaller countries and smaller markets for startups. We are going towards that, but I think it's still going to be 20 years to see this from where you are not mattering at all. And we have, I don't know, in the end, we have thousands of years of cultures, local cultures that we need to be syncing all together. This is happening, but it will still take a little bit more time. On the other side, I think it's also about the founders, the startup founders' mindset, because if you think, Romania is a decent country with a decent market, but actually it's not that much like that, because it can be a trap. Because in the moment when you launch your idea and you say, I'm going to reach the Romanian market, conquer it, and then I'm going to move to another country around, in the same time, another founder from another country will think the same about their market. And by the time you grow here in Romania, you might have lost the window of opportunity for other countries, and then you kind of get to battle with competition instead of thinking ambitiously and going to a larger country. So Romanian market being in the middle, above middle, I would say, as a market, it can be a trap. But for example, if you're a, I don't know, Moldavian or Slovenian founder, you don't have a market in your own country, or it's very little. So then it pushes you, okay, where can I go in order to be more impactful? So they choose bigger markets, and they go there, and theoretically they have a better chances of better success because of a better market adoption.
And if you would think, maybe it's a philosophical question, what is the role of Romania in the regional and European ecosystem? What would be our identity? Maybe not now, but afterwards. What would be that? What can we be?
Okay, a couple of ideas pop here, and I don't think it's just about one. On the other side, definitely, as it is all over Eastern Europe, it's the technical talent which can be well used, and it is used, but it definitely could be more. As well, I see Romania as a place for outside startup founders to come and build together the tech team, the product team, and even live here in a more capital, and even live here in a country which is maybe not that expensive to create a startup and have access to some funding that you might not have access because of competing startups applying for the same funding lies probably in Western Europe. I also think Romania is a good place to live in terms of nature and having as well team building areas or events like this, which are good to have on living in a healthier environment. Let's say you work on your startup, but as well you can have other activities aside the startup. I think on the bigger strategic level, Romania is considered safe, but this is a chance that we don't have for many years, because once we see the European Union enlarging and then Ukraine joining, where there's a lot of technical talent, that will be a challenge for Romania, because people might be going towards Ukraine, or for example Serbia or the countries in ex-Yugoslavia as well are having a good coverage. So we have a window of opportunity to position ourselves. I believe that if we go on vertical knowledge, we can be more attractive for specific areas where startup founders could come from outside. Hey, I want to build maybe health tech startup or urban mobility startup, because there are many challenges here in Romania that could be sorted out, solved out, or piloted. But in order to create the testing field, the pilot ground for startups, you need to have the regulations in place, you need to have the administration on board, you need to have the ecosystem support for startup founders to do that from the outside, to be incentivized to come here, and as well the funding availability.
Talking about verticals, let's take health tech, for example, which is a very good example you mentioned, which is developed in Cluj. what are the things that this verticalization can be taught from the health tech example from Cluj, if we take it?
And so I think if we think about a local or a region or a country positioning itself, it's from the branding perspective, it's good to associate that region or city or country with a couple of specific keywords. Come to Bucharest because you'll find a lot of gaming studios that you can work with and implement your game, for example. Or come to Bucharest because there are a lot of corporations that you can sell and collaborate, or they're open up for to communicate with startups. Come to Cluj because you have health tech programs, or come to Brașov or Constanța because you have tourism in place and you can pilot your ideas. So I think is on one side is the branding. Second is a couple of success examples based on local resources which were built and you can show them as case studies. Third is aligning the resources in such a way that you have access to expertise. So this could be mentors, investors, or acceleration programs that piled up together make it attractive on a vertical. And as well, communication. I think the communication is important both between on the startup founder area, but as well when it comes to local authorities, investors, community events organizers, and program managers. For example, in Cluj and companies who are supporting. In Cluj, we have a monthly meeting called Manifesto Meeting, and we gather around 20-25 people from the local ecosystem, and we think on events, on programs, on what we need for help, on anything that we can communicate and support each other. So meetings like this are actually creating trust in between people. So this trust enables more communication and projects. And now we have around 5 or 6 programs in Cluj because we built up in time all this, and I think this is just the beginning in order to grow the ecosystem. And the same, I think it happens in other cities as well, but I'm not that familiar with them. So it's the diversity of the ecosystem which creates a lot of engagement and a lot of Brownian movement, let's call it this way, and then this piles up towards something. But it takes time, and oftentimes it's chaotic. Oftentimes it can be disappointing because you don't see results soon enough, but it's a long-term game.
When talking about, maybe it's a generalization, but we're talking about Romanian founders, what are some of the things they are still not lacking, but doing not in the right way? What are some of the bad things, let's say?
Yeah, so if it's there are some general things which can be visible in more ecosystems, so educating about what it means to have a startup, education about access to capital. But in general, I do not see the Romanian founders strong enough in terms of business skills, business vision, and ambition. So a startup, although it has the technology and the product, you need to align a lot of things around the product. So from this perspective, I think because of the general economic state that we are and the evolution of the country, the business expertise is not developed enough, and the ambition. So I would like to see founders in Romania who think, of course, of the local market, but first it's about conquering a bigger market and being ambitious enough, because then you will have impact coming back on the local level much stronger than if you go in the local market from the beginning, which, as I mentioned earlier, it could be a challenge or a trap because you get stuck in it. So more ambitions and asking for more. This I see as a blockage oftentimes. The Romanian founders are not courageous enough to ask for help or be pushy and hey, for example, you contact an investor and you send an email, the investor doesn't reply in a week, or say he's not interested. But maybe that person didn't even have the time to check the email, so that's why you need to follow up with 3 or 4 emails until they reply. So I have cases like this. Startup from Cluj raised from an American fund like €3 million, and the startup only answered they managed to get back after 3 or 4 reminders. So it can happen, this thing that, hey, I assume that they are not interested, but it's much better to have a no upfront or at some point than just presuming that it's a no.
We are too educated,
yeah,
maybe too.
So I think this relent I think this ambition, this drive to build, this courage, and this acceptance of getting no, but still doing it and being relentless, going towards that aim. I think it's more about the mindset and as well about the mental health, the ambition and the state with which the attitude that we go into startups. So I think the more examples we see like this, it's proving us that we can do it differently, and this wires the founders to think a little bit different. Okay, I have this example. Oh, it's possible to do it this way. Oh, it's possible to grow my startup here and then move it on the New York Stock Exchange and in New York and then doing an IPO there. Okay, so now I see that it's possible from Romania. Okay, let's do it.
How would you describe Cluj to a foreign investor? From a brand, you talked about branding.
Cluj is a small enough place in order to have consistency, but as well big enough in order to have diversity. So when it comes to tech talent, when it comes to expertise on health and testing ground for various products, it's a good place to be because you're within reach and the network is already formed in order to do things on the early level quite fast.
And lastly, what title would you give to a documentary about Romanian startups?
Documentary.
Yes, to this documentary, what title would you give?
Well, Tigers of Eastern Europe is taken.
Yeah.
So a title for a documentary about the startup ecosystem, I would say dreamer but not ambitious enough.